Hi, I'm Jessica. When my father looked across our Thanksgiving dinner table, his eyes cold as November frost, and said those words that would shatter what remained of our family pretense, I felt 28 years of disappointment crystallize into a single, devastating moment. "If you left forever, we'd all be happier," he declared, his voice carrying across the silent dining room like a death sentence. The turkey sat carved and cooling between us, surrounded by all the traditional fixings my mother had spent days preparing, but suddenly, everything tasted like ash. What none of them knew, as they nodded in agreement or stared uncomfortably at their plates, was the phone call I'd received just 3 days earlier. The one that would change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The drive to my childhood home in Millbrook always filled me with a familiar dread, but this November felt particularly heavy. I gripped the steering wheel of my modest Honda Civic, watching the suburban streets of my hometown scroll past like a depressing slideshow of everything I'd tried to escape. The houses grew larger and more manicured as I approached my parents' neighborhood, each perfectly maintained lawn a testament to the kind of conventional success I'd apparently failed to achieve. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, and I glanced down to see another text from my older brother Michael. "Mom's already asking when you're going to bring someone home. Just warning you." I sighed, knowing that would be the least of my problems today. Michael had been married to his college sweetheart for 5 years now, lived in a McMansion 20 minutes from our parents, and worked as a financial advisor at the same firm where our father had spent his entire career. He was everything our parents had hoped I would become, and everything I had actively chosen not to be. My younger sister Amanda would be there too, fresh from her engagement to a lawyer she'd met at the country club. At 25, she'd already accomplished what our parents considered the most important milestone: finding a suitable husband from an appropriate family. The fact that she worked part-time at an art gallery was tolerated because it was seen as a charming hobby rather than a serious career ambition. Then there was me, Jessica Carter, the family disappointment. 28 years old, unmarried, living in a small apartment in Chicago, working what my parents dismissively called that writing thing. For the past 6 years, I'd been scraping together a living as a freelance journalist, covering everything from local politics to arts and culture for various publications. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't lucrative, but it was mine. Every article one published felt like a small victory, every byline a proof of my existence, in a world that often seemed determined to ignore me. My parents had never understood my choice to pursue journalism. "It's not a real career," my mother would say, her voice tinged with the kind of disappointment usually reserved for discussing terminal illnesses. "You're wasting your education." I had graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern with a degree in journalism and political science, but that achievement seemed to pale in comparison to my siblings' more traditional paths. The criticism had started early and never really stopped. Why couldn't I be more like Michael, building a stable career in finance? Why couldn't I find a nice young man and settle down like Amanda? Why did I insist on pursuing this impractical dream that would never provide the security and respectability they valued above all else? Every family gathering became an exercise in defending choices I shouldn't have had to justify. I pulled into the circular driveway of my parents' colonial-style home, noting that Michael's BMW and Amanda's Mercedes were already parked near the front entrance. Of course they were early. They always were, eager to claim their spots as the favored children before the black sheep arrived. I sat in my car for a moment, gathering the courage to face what I knew would be another afternoon of subtle and not-so-subtle disapproval. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The front door opened before I could even ring the bell, my mother appearing in her perfectly coordinated Thanksgiving outfit, her graying hair styled in the same conservative cut she'd worn for the past decade. "Jessica, there you are," she said, her smile bright but brittle. "We were beginning to wonder if you'd changed your mind about coming." "Hi, Mom," I replied, accepting her brief hug. Traffic was heavier than I expected. She ushered me inside, where the familiar smells of roasted turkey and pumpkin pie should have felt comforting, but instead made my stomach clench with anxiety. The house looked exactly the same as it had during my childhood. Cream-colored walls adorned with family photos that seemed to feature me less and less prominently as the years went on, furniture that prioritized appearance over comfort, and an overall atmosphere of rigid propriety. "Jessica!" Amanda's voice rang out from the living room, artificially bright in the way it always became during family gatherings. She appeared in the doorway wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than I made in a month, her engagement ring catching the light as she gestured. "I was just telling everyone about the wedding preparations. You'll never believe how much work goes into planning the perfect ceremony." I followed her into the living room, where Michael sat in our father's favorite armchair, looking completely at home in his success. He raised his beer bottle in greeting, his expression neutral but not unkind. "Hey Jess, how's the writing business?" Before I could answer, my father emerged from his study, still wearing the conservative suit he favored even on holidays. Robert Carter had always been an imposing figure, tall and stern with the kind of commanding presence that had served him well in his banking career. His hair had gone completely silver in recent years, but his disapproving frown remained as sharp as ever. "Jessica," he said, his tone suggesting my presence was both expected and unwelcome. "Still driving that old Honda, I see." "It gets me where I need to go," I replied, already feeling the familiar defensive tension creeping up my shoulders. "Reliability is important," he acknowledged. "But so is projecting an image of success. How do you expect potential employers to take you seriously when you show up looking like you can't afford proper transportation?" Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair, while Amanda suddenly became very interested in her manicure. This was how it always started. A seemingly innocent observation that was actually a criticism wrapped in paternal concern. "I work primarily remotely, Dad," I said, keeping my voice level. "Most of my editors have never seen my car." "Remote work," he repeated, as though the concept were fundamentally flawed. "No wonder you're struggling to advance in your career. Success requires face-to-face networking, building relationships, being visible in your industry." My mother appeared with a tray of appetizers, her timing suspiciously perfect. "Let's not talk business before dinner," she said in the artificially cheerful tone she used when trying to redirect uncomfortable conversations. "Jessica, would you like some wine? I opened that nice Chardonnay you brought last Christmas." The fact that she remembered I'd brought wine last year surprised me, until I realized she was probably just being polite. I accepted a glass gratefully, hoping the alcohol might help me navigate the emotional minefield that every family gathering had become. Dinner was announced shortly after, and we filed into the dining room where my mother had outdone herself with the presentation. The table was set with her best china and crystal, the centerpiece an elaborate arrangement of autumn flowers and miniature pumpkins. It should have been beautiful, but all I could see were the empty chairs that seemed to emphasize my solitary status. "The table looks lovely, Mom," I said, genuinely appreciating the effort she'd put into the presentation. "Thank you, dear," she replied, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "I do wish we had a few more people to fill it out. Michael, you and Sarah should really think about starting a family soon. And Amanda, once you're married, I hope you'll consider settling down nearby." The implication was clear. I was the only one not contributing to the family's future, the only one not building the kind of life that would give my parents grandchildren and continued connection. I took a larger sip of wine than I'd intended, feeling the familiar burn of inadequacy. As we passed dishes around the table, the conversation naturally turned to updates on everyone's lives. Michael discussed his recent promotion and the vacation home he and Sarah were considering purchasing. Amanda gushed about wedding venues and guest lists, her excitement genuine and infectious. When the attention finally turned to me, the energy in the room shifted perceptibly. "So, Jessica," my father said, carving the turkey with more force than necessary, "are you still freelancing, or have you found a real job yet?" The question hit me like a physical blow. 6 years of building my career, of establishing relationships with editors, of developing expertise in areas I was passionate about, And he still referred to my work as though it were an extended internship. I'm still freelancing, I said, my voice tighter than I'd intended. I've been working on some larger projects lately, longer-form pieces that require more research and investigation. Investigation, he repeated, his tone suggesting I'd claimed to be a secret agent. What exactly do you investigate? Celebrity gossip? Restaurant reviews? Michael cleared his throat uncomfortably. Dad, Jess has had some good pieces published. I saw that article about the school funding crisis in the Tribune. That was solid work. I felt a rush of gratitude toward my brother, even as I recognized the subtle condescension in his praise. He was trying to help, but his tone suggested he was surprised I'd managed to produce anything worthwhile. The Tribune, my father mused. Local newspaper. I suppose that's something, though hardly the kind of career that builds financial security. Not everyone measures success purely in financial terms, I said, immediately regretting the defensive edge in my voice. No, he agreed. But financial stability is what allows you to pursue other interests. It's what gives you options. What happens when you get older, Jessica? When you want to buy a house, start a family? You can't build a life on the irregular income of freelance writing. My mother jumped in with forced brightness. I'm sure Jessica will figure things out. She's always been so creative. Maybe she'll write a novel someday, something that could really take off. Her attempt at support actually made things worse, reducing my professional journalism to a hobby that might someday become profitable if I got lucky. I realized that in their minds, I wasn't a real journalist at all, just someone playing at being a writer, until I came to my senses and chose a more practical path. I'm not interested in writing novels, I said quietly. I'm a journalist. I investigate important stories, hold people in power accountable, inform the public about issues that matter. Of course, dear, my mother said in the same tone she might use to humor a child's fantasy about becoming an astronaut. The conversation moved on to safer topics, but the damage was done. I sat through the rest of dinner feeling invisible. My contributions to family discussions met with polite but dismissive responses. When Amanda talked about her wedding plans, everyone leaned in with genuine interest. When Michael discussed his latest client success, my father offered praise and advice. When I mentioned a particularly challenging investigation I'd been working on, the response was perfunctory acknowledgement before the subject was quickly changed. As we finished the main course and my mother began clearing plates for dessert, the conversation took a turn that would change everything. Amanda was describing her future mother-in-law's expectations for the wedding when my father suddenly set down his wine glass with more force than necessary. Speaking of expectations, he said, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone stop talking. I think it's time we had an honest conversation about this family. The room fell silent, except for the distant sound of my mother loading the dishwasher in the kitchen. Michael and Amanda exchanged glances, sensing that whatever was coming wouldn't be pleasant. We've all been walking on eggshells for years, my father continued, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl, pretending that what we have here is normal, that this dynamic is sustainable. Dad, Michael started, but my father held up a hand to silence him. No, this needs to be polite. We gather here every holiday, every birthday, every family occasion, and we pretend. We pretend that it's normal for one family member to consistently bring negativity and disappointment to every celebration. We pretend that it's acceptable for someone to reach nearly 30 years old without any real accomplishments, without any stability, without any consideration for how their choices affect the rest of us. I felt the blood drain from my face as his words hit me. What are you saying? I'm saying that maybe it's time we stopped pretending, he replied, his voice growing stronger as though he'd been building up to this moment for years. Maybe it's time we acknowledged that some people just don't fit, that some family members cause more stress and disappointment than joy. My mother had returned from the kitchen and stood frozen in the doorway, a serving spoon still in her hand. Amanda was staring at her plate as though she could disappear into it, while Michael looked genuinely shocked by the direction the conversation had taken. Robert, my mother said quietly, this isn't the time or place. When is the time, Linda? He asked, turning to her with the same intensity. When is it acceptable to point out that our family gatherings have become exercises in managing one person's inability to meet basic adult expectations? When do we acknowledge that Jessica's presence here has become more obligation than pleasure? The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. I felt as though I'd been slapped, the casual cruelty of his assessment hitting me harder than any of his previous criticisms. This wasn't about my career choices or my lifestyle anymore. This was about my fundamental worth as a family member, as a human being. I think, my father continued, his voice taking on the measured tone he used when delivering particularly harsh business decisions, that it might be better for everyone if Jessica seriously considered whether her continued involvement in family events is beneficial for anyone involved. "You're asking me to stop coming to family gatherings?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm suggesting," he said carefully, "that maybe it's time to consider whether your presence here contributes positively to anyone's experience, including your own." Michael finally found his voice. "Dad, that's enough. You can't just kick Jessica out of the family because you don't approve of her career." "This isn't about career disapproval," my father replied, though we all knew that wasn't true. "This is about the pattern of behavior, the consistent inability to meet reasonable expectations, the way every family event becomes an exercise in managing disappointment." I looked around the table at the faces of my family members. My mother looked stricken but said nothing. Amanda was still avoiding eye contact, her discomfort obvious but her silence telling. Michael appeared angry but also uncertain, as though he wasn't sure how far he was willing to go in defending me. "Let me make this easier for everyone," my father said, his voice taking on a tone of finality that I recognized from childhood punishments. "Jessica, if you left forever, we'd all be happier." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. The dining room fell completely silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, marking the seconds that felt like hours. I stared at my father, searching his face for any sign that he might take back what he'd just said, but his expression remained set in stone. "Robert!" my mother finally gasped, her shock breaking through her usual diplomatic restraint. "It needed to be said," he replied, not taking his eyes off me. "We've all been thinking it. I'm just the only one honest enough to say it out loud." I felt tears building behind my eyes but refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of them, not when they'd already decided I was too weak to handle their honesty. Instead, I carefully folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate, my hands surprisingly steady despite the emotional earthquake happening inside me. "Well," I said, my voice quieter than I'd intended but clear, "I guess it's a good thing I have something to tell you all." The change in my tone must have registered, because everyone suddenly looked directly at me for the first time all evening. Even my father's expression shifted slightly, perhaps recognizing that something significant was about to happen. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, opening the email I'd received 3 days earlier, the one I'd been planning to share with them during dessert, back when I still believed this dinner might end with celebration instead of devastation. "3 days ago," I began, my voice growing stronger with each word, "I received a call from the editor-in-chief of the Washington Post." The room remained silent, but I could see the shift in attention, the way everyone's focus sharpened despite their apparent disinterest in my career. "For the past 8 months, I've been working on an investigative series about corruption in municipal water systems across the Midwest. It started as a local story for a Chicago publication, but as I dug deeper, I uncovered a pattern of cover-ups and health violations that affects millions of people." I looked directly at my father as I continued. "The Post has been following my work, and they offered me a staff position, senior investigative reporter, 6-figure salary, full benefits, relocation assistance to Washington, D.C. The silence in the room took on a different quality now, charged with surprise and uncertainty. Amanda's eyes widened, and Michael leaned forward in his chair. "But that's not all," I continued, feeling a strange sense of calm descending over me. "Last month, the series won the Sigma Delta Chi Award for Excellence in Journalism. Next week, I'll be notified about the Pulitzer Prize nomination." My mother's hand went to her throat, and my father's expression shifted from dismissive certainty to confused attention. "The water contamination story has already led to the resignation of 3 municipal officials and prompted federal investigations in 4 states. The families affected by the cover-ups have asked me to speak at a congressional hearing next month about the systemic failures that put their children's health at risk." I stood up slowly, my legs steadier than I'd expected. "So when you say that if I left forever you'd all be happier, I think you should know exactly what you're choosing to lose." The room erupted in chaos. Amanda's mouth fell open in shock, Michael started asking rapid-fire questions, and my mother began what sounded like the beginning of an apology. But my father just stared at me, his face cycling through expressions I'd never seen before: surprise, confusion, and something that might have been pride warring with his ingrained disappointment. "The Washington Post?" my mother whispered. "Jessica, why didn't you tell us?" "I was going to," I replied, looking around at their stunned faces. "I thought today would be perfect. I thought you'd want to celebrate with me." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. For years, they'd dismissed my work as inconsequential, my career as a fantasy, my choices as fundamentally flawed. And now, faced with evidence that I'd achieved exactly the kind of recognition and success they claimed to value, they didn't know how to respond. My father cleared his throat, and I could see him struggling to reconcile his perception of me with this new information. "Jessica, we had no idea you were working on anything so significant." "You never asked," I said simply. "You never wanted to know details about my work because you'd already decided it wasn't important." Michael found his voice first. "Jess, this is incredible. Why didn't you tell us sooner?" "Because every time I tried to talk about my work, you changed the subject," I replied. "Because every conversation about my career became a lecture about financial security and traditional success. Because I learned that sharing my professional life with you only led to criticism and disappointment." Amanda was staring at me as though I'd suddenly transformed into a completely different person. "You're going to work for the Washington Post?" "I haven't accepted yet," I said. "I wanted to discuss it with my family first. I thought it might be nice to have your support as I made this decision." The weight of what had almost happened began to settle over the room. My father had just told me to leave forever, moments before learning that I'd achieved the kind of professional success he'd spent years telling me was impossible through my chosen career path. "This changes things," my mother said softly, though I wasn't sure if she was talking to me or to herself. "Does it?" I asked, genuinely curious about her answer. "Does my professional success change whether you want me in your lives? Does external validation make me worthy of family membership?" The question hung in the air, forcing them to confront the conditional nature of their love and acceptance. I realized that this moment was about more than just my career achievements. It was about whether they could see me as a complete person, worthy of respect and inclusion, regardless of whether my choices aligned with their expectations. My father was the first to speak, his voice quieter than I'd heard it all evening. "Jessica, I owe you an apology." "Do you?" I asked. "Or are you just sorry that you were wrong about my potential for success?" The distinction mattered, and we all knew it. Was he apologizing for the cruelty of his words, or just for the tactical error of dismissing someone who turned out to be more accomplished than he'd realized? "Both," he admitted after a long pause. "I was wrong about your career, and I was wrong to speak to you the way I did. But mostly, I was wrong to make my approval contingent on your achievements, rather than simply loving you as my daughter." It was more self-awareness than I'd ever heard from him, and I felt something inside me soften slightly. But the hurt was still too fresh, the years of criticism and dismissal too deeply embedded, for his words to completely heal the damage that had been done. "I appreciate that," I said carefully, "but I need you to understand that this isn't just about tonight. This is about years of feeling like I had to earn my place in this family, like my worth was constantly being evaluated and found lacking." My mother moved closer, her eyes bright with tears she was trying not to shed. "We love you, Jessica. We've always loved you." "But you haven't always liked me," I replied. "You haven't always respected me. You've tolerated me, managed me, tried to change me, but you haven't accepted me as I am." The truth of that statement settled over the room like a heavy blanket. For years, our family dynamics had been built on the assumption that I needed to change, to become more like Michael or Amanda, to choose a path that made sense to them. The possibility that I might be successful and fulfilled exactly as I was had never really been considered. As I looked around at their faces, I realized that this moment represented a crossroads not just for me, but for all of us. We could continue with the old patterns, the conditional love and constant criticism, or we could try to build something new. Something based on acceptance rather than judgment, respect rather than disappointment. But that choice couldn't be mine alone. It had to be something we all committed to, and I wasn't sure they were ready for that kind of fundamental change. The revelation about my professional success had shocked them into reconsidering their assumptions about me, but shock fades. The real test would be whether they could sustain this new perspective when the novelty wore off and old habits reasserted themselves. "I need some time to think," I said finally. "About the job offer, about tonight, about what kind of relationship we want to have going forward." "Of course," my mother said quickly. "Take all the time you need. And Jessica, congratulations. We should have said that first. We should have celebrated your success instead of—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that would have acknowledged just how badly they'd handled everything. I gathered my purse and coat, preparing to leave the house that had never quite felt like home. As I reached the front door, my father called out behind me. "Jessica," he said, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty I'd never heard before. "When you decide about the job, about everything, I hope you'll let us know. I hope we'll still be part of your life." I turned back to look at him, this man who had just told me the family would be happier without me, now asking to remain connected to my future. The irony was almost overwhelming. "I hope so too, Dad," I said. "But that's going to depend on whether you can see me as I actually am, not as who you think I should be." With that, I walked out into the November evening, leaving behind the wreckage of what had been supposed to be a family celebration. The air was crisp and clean, after the stifling atmosphere of the dining room, and I breathed deeply for what felt like the first time all day. As I sat in my car before driving away, I looked back at the house where I'd grown up, where I'd learned to seek approval that seemed always just out of reach. The windows glowed warmly in the darkness, and I could see the silhouettes of my family members still gathered around the dining room table, probably trying to process what had just happened. For the first time in my adult life, I felt completely free from their expectations and judgments. The professional recognition I'd achieved had given me a kind of armor against their criticism, but more than that, their reaction tonight had shown me just how conditional their love had always been. That knowledge was painful, but it was also liberating. I started the engine and pulled out of the driveway, driving away from my childhood home with a clarity I'd never experienced before. Behind me, my family was probably still trying to understand how they'd gotten everything so wrong. Ahead of me, Washington, D.C., and a career that would finally match my ambitions and talents. The choice between staying in Chicago near my family and accepting the dream job in D.C. had seemed complicated when I first received the offer. Now, as I drove through the quiet suburban streets toward the highway that would take me back to my real life, the decision felt remarkably clear. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love us unconditionally are the last ones to see our true worth. Sometimes we have to choose between their approval and our own authenticity. Tonight, for the first time in my life, I'd chosen myself. The drive back to Chicago felt like traveling through a fog of disbelief. I kept replaying the evening in my mind, each cruel word from my father echoing in the silence of my Honda. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, illuminated by the occasional streetlight, while behind me, the comfortable suburban world of my childhood grew smaller in the rearview mirror. I'd left that house feeling simultaneously vindicated and devastated, carrying both the weight of professional triumph and the sting of family rejection. My phone buzzed repeatedly on the passenger seat, but I ignored it. I wasn't ready to deal with whatever damage control my family might be attempting, or the questions they'd suddenly developed about my career, now that it had proven worthy of their attention. The silence of the drive gave me space to process what had just happened, to understand how dramatically my life had shifted in the span of a single evening. By the time I reached my apartment building in Lincoln Park, exhaustion had settled into my bones like a physical weight. The building was a converted brownstone from the 1920s. Nothing fancy, but with character that reminded me why I'd chosen Chicago over any number of other cities. My one-bedroom unit on the third floor had been home for the past 4 years, long enough for me to transform it from a generic rental into something that actually reflected who I was. I climbed the stairs slowly, my heels clicking against the worn wooden steps, and fumbled with my keys at the door. Inside, my apartment welcomed me with its familiar warmth. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, Research materials and newspaper clippings covered my desk, and my laptop sat open where I'd left it that morning, still displaying the email from the Washington Post that had started this entire emotional earthquake. I kicked off my heels and poured myself a generous glass of wine, settling into the reading chair I'd inherited from my grandmother. The same grandmother who had encouraged my love of reading and writing, who had never questioned my dreams or suggested I should want something more conventional. She'd been gone for 5 years now, but I still felt her presence in this apartment, in the way I'd arranged my workspace, in the stubborn determination that had carried me through tonight's confrontation. My phone finally stopped buzzing, but I could see the notifications piling up on the screen. 7 missed calls from my mother, 3 from Michael, 2 from Amanda, and a series of text messages I wasn't yet ready to read. Whatever they wanted to say could wait until I'd had time to process my own feelings about what had transpired. I opened my laptop and read through the job offer email again, studying each line with fresh eyes. The salary was more than I'd ever imagined earning, the benefits package comprehensive, the opportunity to work with some of the most respected investigative journalists in the country. But beyond the professional advantages, the position represented something even more valuable. Validation that the path I'd chosen, despite my family's disapproval, had been the right one all along. The water contamination investigation that had caught the Post's attention had consumed the better part of a year. It started when I received a tip from a public health nurse in Flint about similar issues in smaller communities that weren't getting media coverage. What began as a straightforward piece about municipal negligence had evolved into something much larger as I discovered connections between contaminated water systems, political cover-ups, and corporate interests across multiple states. The investigation required skills I'd developed over years of freelance work, the ability to build trust with sources who were often risking their jobs to speak with me, the patience to sift through thousands of documents looking for patterns and inconsistencies, and the persistence to keep digging when official sources tried to shut down my inquiries. It was exactly the kind of work I dreamed of doing when I first chose journalism as my career, the kind of reporting that could actually make a difference in people's lives. The families I'd interviewed during the investigation haunted my thoughts. Parents who'd watched their children develop mysterious illnesses, elderly residents whose health had deteriorated after years of drinking contaminated water, community leaders who'd been silenced when they tried to raise concerns. Their stories deserved to be told, and the officials responsible for the cover-ups deserved to be held accountable. That sense of purpose had driven me through months of research, through the frustration of unresponsive bureaucrats, through the financial uncertainty of freelance work. Now the Washington Post wanted to give me the platform and resources to tackle even bigger stories, to investigate corruption and injustice on a national scale. It was everything I'd worked toward, everything I'd sacrificed family approval to pursue. And yet, as I sat in my apartment processing the events of the evening, I felt surprisingly uncertain about what my answer should be. My phone rang again, startling me from my thoughts. This time it was a number I didn't recognize, probably a spam call. But when I checked the voicemail that followed, I was surprised to hear a familiar voice. "Jessica, this is David Chen from the Tribune. I hope you don't mind me calling your personal number, but I wanted to reach out about something time-sensitive." David was the editor who'd published several of my pieces over the past 2 years, including the first article in the water contamination series. "I heard through the grapevine about the Post offer, and I wanted to discuss a proposition with you before you make your final decision. Give me a call when you get this, regardless of the time." I stared at the phone, wondering how word had already gotten out about the job offer. The journalism community in Chicago was smaller than most people realized, and news traveled fast between publications. David's call suggested that my potential departure was already generating discussion, which both flattered and intimidated me. Before I could decide whether to return his call immediately, my apartment buzzer rang. I glanced at the clock, surprised to see it was nearly 11 p.m. Through the intercom, I heard Michael's voice, slightly distorted but unmistakably urgent. "Jess, it's me. Can I come up? I've been driving around for 2 hours, trying to figure out what to say." I hesitated for a moment, not sure I was ready for another family confrontation, but something in his tone convinced me to buzz him in. Michael had been the closest thing to an ally I'd had during tonight's dinner, even if his support had been limited. Maybe he could help me make sense of what had happened. He appeared at my door a few minutes later, still wearing his Thanksgiving dinner clothes, but looking rumpled and tired. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, and his face carried an expression of genuine distress that I rarely saw from my successful, composed older brother. "Can I come in?" he asked, and I stepped aside to let him pass. He looked around my apartment with what seemed like fresh eyes, taking in the organized chaos of my workspace, the walls of books, the framed copies of articles I'd published. "I've never really looked at this place before," he said quietly. "I mean, I've been here, but I never really saw it." "What do you mean?" I asked, settling back into my chair while he remained standing near the window. "It looks like the home of someone who's building something important," he said, running his hand through his hair. "Like the workspace of a real journalist, not someone playing at being a writer." The observation stung because it was so accurate. My family had visited my apartment multiple times over the years, but they'd never really seen it. They'd focused on what it lacked: a second bedroom for a future family, expensive furniture that would signal financial success, the suburban markers of conventional achievement. They'd never noticed what it contained: the tools and atmosphere of a working journalist, the evidence of a career built through determination and talent. "Michael, what are you doing here?" I asked, suddenly too tired for diplomatic conversation. He turned from the window to face me directly. I wanted to apologize. For tonight, for all the times I should have stood up for you but didn't, for not understanding what you were actually accomplishing. "You don't need to apologize," I said, though part of me appreciated hearing it. "You didn't say those things." "No, but I didn't stop them either," he replied, moving to sit on my couch. "I let Dad talk to you like that because it was easier than confronting him. I let them dismiss your work because I didn't really understand it myself." I studied his face, searching for signs that this was just guilt-talking rather than genuine understanding. "What changed your mind?" "After you left, I went home and looked up your articles online," he said. "I read the entire water contamination series, and then I read everything else you've published in the past 2 years. Jess, your work is incredible. It's not just good journalism, it's the kind of reporting that changes things, that matters." Hearing those words from Michael affected me more than I'd expected. For years, I'd craved exactly this kind of recognition from my family: the acknowledgement that my work had value beyond what they could measure in salary figures or traditional success markers. "The series about the school board corruption in Oak Park," he continued. "I had no idea that was you. Sarah and I were following that story because we're thinking about buying a house in that district. When I realized you were the reporter who exposed the whole thing, I felt like an idiot for not knowing." "You never asked about my work," I pointed out, not accusingly but as a simple statement of fact. "I know," he said, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "And that's on me. I assumed that if it was important, you'd tell us more about it." I didn't realize that we'd made it clear we weren't interested in hearing about it. The admission revealed something I'd never fully articulated, even to myself. I had stopped sharing details about my professional life with my family not because the work wasn't significant, but because their response had taught me that they didn't want to hear about it. Every attempt to discuss an investigation or celebrate a publication had been met with polite disinterest or subtle redirection toward topics they found more appropriate. "The post offer," Michael said carefully. "Are you going to take it?" "I don't know," I admitted. 3 days ago, it seemed like an obvious yes. Now everything feels more complicated. "Because of what happened tonight?" I considered his question, trying to untangle the various factors influencing my decision. "Partly, but also because taking the job means admitting that I can't build the life I want here, near family. It means accepting that choosing my career requires choosing distance from all of you." Michael was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the implications of what I'd said. What if it didn't have to mean that? "What do you mean?" "What if we could figure out how to have a real relationship, one where you don't have to choose between your career and your family?" He looked around my apartment again, his gaze settling on my desk covered with research materials. "What if we actually tried to understand what you do, to support it instead of tolerating it?" The possibility he was suggesting felt both appealing and dangerous. I'd spent years building emotional armor against my family's disapproval, learning to find validation elsewhere, constructing a sense of self that didn't depend on their acceptance. The idea of lowering those defenses, of risking that kind of vulnerability again, scared me. Michael, I appreciate what you're saying, I began carefully, but one conversation doesn't undo years of feeling like I had to justify my existence to this family. I know, he said quickly, and I'm not saying it would be easy or immediate, but tonight showed me something I should have seen years ago. We've been so focused on who we thought you should be that we completely missed who you actually are. He pulled out his phone and showed me something on the screen. After I read your articles, I did some research on the Sigma Delta Chi Award. Do you know how big a deal that is? Do you know how many established journalists with decades of experience never win recognition like that? I did know, which was why the award had meant so much to me. But hearing Michael acknowledge its significance felt like a small miracle. And the Pulitzer nomination, he continued. I looked that up too. Jess, if you win that, you'll be one of the youngest journalists ever to receive that recognition. I probably won't win, I said automatically, the same disclaimer I'd been giving myself to manage expectations. But you might, he insisted. And whether you do or not, the nomination itself is incredible. Dad should be bragging about you to everyone he knows instead of acting like your career is an embarrassment. The conversation was interrupted by my phone ringing. David Chen's name appeared on the screen, and I realized I'd never returned his earlier call. I should take this, I told Michael. It's work-related. David, I'm sorry I didn't call back earlier, I said, answering the phone. No problem at all, his voice came through clearly. I hope it's not too late to talk. I have something I wanted to discuss with you about a potential opportunity here at the Tribune. I glanced at Michael, who was listening with obvious curiosity. What kind of opportunity? We've been following your work closely, especially the water contamination investigation. The impact it's having, the recognition it's receiving, has convinced our board that we need to expand our investigative team. We want to offer you a position as senior investigative reporter, with a mandate to pursue exactly the kind of long-form, high-impact stories you've been developing as a freelancer. The timing of his call felt surreal. David, I appreciate the interest, but I should tell you that I've received an offer from the Washington Post. I know, he said, surprising me. Which is why I'm calling tonight instead of waiting until Monday. I'm not going to pretend we can match their salary offer, but I think we can offer you something they can't. What's that? The chance to stay in Chicago, near your support network, while building the kind of investigative program you'd want to lead. Complete editorial independence, a research budget, the freedom to pursue stories that matter to you. And Jessica, we're talking about making you the youngest department head in the Tribune's history. I felt my heart rate accelerate as he laid out the details. The Tribune had been my first real supporter in Chicago. The publication that had taken chances on my work when other outlets were still treating me like an inexperienced freelancer. The idea of building an investigative team there, of staying in the city that had become my real home, appealed to me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Can I think about it? I asked. Of course. But I need to know soon. If you're interested, I'd like to set up a meeting for Monday morning to discuss specifics. After I hung up, Michael was staring at me with an expression of amazement. 2 job offers in 1 week? Apparently, I said, feeling slightly overwhelmed by the rapid succession of opportunities. The Tribune offer, he said thoughtfully, that would mean staying in Chicago. Yes. Near family. I looked at him carefully, trying to read his expression. Is that your way of asking me to stay? I'm asking you to consider that taking the Post job might be running away from something that could be fixed, he said. I'm asking you to think about whether there's a chance we could build the kind of relationship we should have had all along. The conversation we were having felt unprecedented in our family's history. Michael was treating me as an equal, recognizing my professional accomplishments, acknowledging the ways our family dynamics had failed me. It was everything I'd wanted from them for years, but it was also happening at a moment when I'd finally stopped needing their approval to feel confident in my choices. Michael, I need you to understand something, I said carefully. For years, I've shaped my decisions around trying to earn this family's respect and acceptance. Tonight, when Dad told me you'd all be happier if I left forever, something fundamental shifted for me. He winced at the reminder of our father's words. He didn't mean that. Maybe not, I acknowledged, but he said it. And in that moment, I realized that I've been giving you all power over my self-worth that you never deserved to have. Michael absorbed this, his expression growing more serious. So what does that mean for us going forward? It means that whatever relationship we build from here has to be different, I said. It can't be based on me proving myself worthy of inclusion. It has to be based on mutual respect and genuine interest in each other's lives. I want that, he said immediately. I think we all do, even if we don't know how to get there from here. Do you? I asked. Because wanting it and being willing to do the work to achieve it are different things. It would mean Dad acknowledging that his approach to parenting me has been destructive. It would mean Mom admitting that her passive enabling of his behavior has been harmful. It would mean all of you making a genuine effort to understand and value what I do, not just when it receives external recognition, but as an ongoing part of who I am. The scope of change I was describing was significant, and we both knew it. Family dynamics that had been established over decades don't shift easily, especially when they've been reinforced by patterns of behavior that felt normal to everyone involved. I think it's possible, Michael said finally. Not easy, but possible. The question is whether you're willing to give us the chance to try. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. When I read it, I felt my stomach drop. Jessica, this is Eleanor Whitmore. I received your contact information from David Chen at the Tribune. I understand you're considering some significant career opportunities, and I'd like to discuss a proposition that might interest you. Could we meet for coffee tomorrow afternoon? I stared at the message, trying to process this new development. Eleanor Whitmore was a name I recognized from Chicago's political and social circles, a philanthropist and civic leader whose foundation funded various social justice initiatives around the city. Why would she want to meet with me? What is it? Michael asked, noticing my expression. I showed him the text, and his eyebrows rose. Eleanor Whitmore wants to meet with you? Do you know who she is? I know she's involved in philanthropy and politics, I said, but I have no idea why she'd want to talk to me. She's one of the most influential people in Chicago, Michael said. Her foundation has funded everything from affordable housing projects to educational reform initiatives. If she wants to meet with you, it's probably about something significant. The day was becoming increasingly surreal. This morning, I'd been planning to share my job offer with my family during a traditional Thanksgiving dinner. Now I was sitting in my apartment at midnight, processing the emotional devastation of my father's rejection, while simultaneously fielding multiple professional opportunities and a mysterious meeting request from one of Chicago's power brokers. I should probably head home, Michael said, glancing at the time. Sarah's probably wondering where I am, and you need time to process everything that's happened. Michael, I said as he stood to leave, I appreciate you coming here tonight. I appreciate you taking the time to understand my work, to see what you'd missed before. I should have done it years ago, he replied. I should have been a better brother to you. After he left, I sat alone in my apartment, surrounded by the detritus of the day's emotional upheaval. The job offers from both the Post and the Tribune represented different paths forward, different versions of the future I could choose. Eleanor Whitmore's meeting request added another unknown variable to an already complex equation. But beneath all the professional considerations was the deeper question Michael had raised: whether it was possible to rebuild my relationship with my family on a foundation of mutual respect rather than conditional acceptance. The conversation with him had shown me that at least one family member was capable of growth and change, but he was also the one who had been least invested in maintaining the destructive patterns that had characterized our family dynamics. My father's transformation, if it was even possible, would be much more difficult. He was a man who had built his identity around being right, around making sound judgments about people and situations. Admitting that he'd been fundamentally wrong about me, about the value of my choices and the significance of my work, would require him to question assumptions that had shaped his worldview for decades. My mother's change would require her to stop being a passive participant in the family's emotional dysfunction. For years, she'd positioned herself as the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over conflicts and maintained surface harmony. But her version of peacekeeping had often meant asking me to accommodate unreasonable behavior, rather than challenging the people who were creating the conflict in the first place. As I prepared for bed, I found myself thinking about my grandmother, about the conversations we'd had during my childhood when I'd felt most misunderstood by the rest of the family. She'd been the one who encouraged my love of reading and writing, who listened to my dreams of becoming a journalist without suggesting I should want something more practical. She died during my second year of freelancing, when I was still struggling to establish myself professionally, but I'd always felt that she would have been proud of what I'd built. "What would you tell me to do, Grandma?" I whispered into the darkness of my bedroom, half expecting to hear her voice offering the kind of clear wisdom she'd provided throughout my childhood. Instead, I heard my own voice, clearer than it had been in years, providing the answer I'd been searching for. The choice I needed to make wasn't really about geography, or job titles or salary figures. It was about whether I was ready to build a life based on my own values and priorities, rather than in reaction to other people's expectations or disappointments. The Washington Post offer represented professional prestige and the chance to work at the highest levels of journalism. The Tribune offer represented the opportunity to build something new while staying connected to the city and relationships that had sustained me. Eleanor Whitmore's meeting might present a third option I hadn't yet considered. But all of these opportunities had emerged because I'd spent years developing my skills, building my expertise, and pursuing stories that mattered to me. They were the result of choices I'd made despite my family's disapproval, not because of their support. That realization was both liberating and sobering. As I finally drifted off to sleep, I found myself looking forward to the next day's meeting with Eleanor Whitmore, curious about what new possibility might emerge from that conversation. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was approaching major decisions from a position of strength rather than defensiveness, choosing between good options rather than trying to prove my worth to people who had never been willing to see it. The emotional devastation of my father's words would take time to heal, but they had also freed me from the exhausting work of seeking approval from people who were determined not to give it. Whatever path I chose moving forward would be mine, based on my own assessment of what would bring me fulfillment and allow me to do the work I felt called to do. The phone calls and text messages from my family continued throughout the night, but I'd turned off the sound, allowing them to accumulate in silence while I focused on my own processing of the day's events. Tomorrow would bring new conversations, new decisions, and new possibilities. Tonight, for the first time in years, I fell asleep feeling completely certain of my own worth, regardless of who else was willing to recognize it. The morning sunlight streaming through my bedroom window felt different somehow, as though the events of the previous evening had shifted the very quality of light in my apartment. I woke with a clarity that surprised me, considering how emotionally drained I'd felt when I finally fell asleep. My phone showed a dozen more messages from family members, but also a confirmation from Eleanor Whitmore's assistant about our afternoon meeting at a cafe in Lincoln Park. I spent the morning researching Eleanor Whitmore more thoroughly, trying to understand why someone of her stature would want to meet with me. What I discovered was impressive and somewhat intimidating. She'd built a foundation focused on social justice initiatives, had served on numerous civic boards, and was known for identifying and supporting emerging leaders in various fields. Her foundation had recently launched an investigative journalism initiative, funding independent reporters working on stories related to government accountability and social equity. The connection began to make sense. My water contamination investigation had uncovered not just environmental violations, but also systemic issues of how government agencies failed to protect vulnerable communities. It was exactly the kind of work her foundation seemed designed to support. I dressed carefully for the meeting, choosing a navy blazer and cream blouse that projected professionalism without being overly formal. As I prepared to leave my apartment, my phone rang with a call from Amanda. I hesitated before answering, unsure whether I was ready for another family conversation. "Jessica?" Amanda's voice sounded smaller than usual, uncertain in a way I'd rarely heard from my confident younger sister. "Hi, Amanda." I wanted to call and apologize for last night, she said quickly, as though she'd rehearsed the words. For not speaking up when Dad said those awful things, for just sitting there like a coward. The apology surprised me. Amanda had always been the most conflict-averse member of our family, the one who maintained her favored status by never challenging our parents' perspectives or decisions. I appreciate that, I said carefully. I keep thinking about what you told us, about the job offers and the awards, she continued. I had no idea you were doing such important work. I feel terrible that I never asked more about your career. Amanda, can I ask you something? I said, settling back into my chair despite my plans to leave for the meeting. Of course. Last night, when Dad was criticizing my life choices, did you agree with him? Did you think I was a disappointment to the family? The pause that followed was longer than I'd expected, and more honest than Amanda's usual immediate reassurances. I thought you were making things harder for yourself than they needed to be, she said finally. I couldn't understand why you'd choose such an uncertain career path when you're smart enough to succeed at anything. I worried that you were prioritizing independence over happiness. And now? Now I'm wondering if I've been defining happiness too narrowly, she admitted. Reading your articles last night, seeing the impact your work has had, I realized that you've been building something meaningful while I've been focused on checking off conventional milestones. The conversation revealed something I hadn't fully understood about Amanda's perspective. She hadn't been dismissive of my choices out of malice, but out of a genuine belief that I was making life unnecessarily difficult for myself. In her world, security and social approval were the foundations of happiness, and my path seemed to reject both. Are you happy, Amanda? I asked gently. I thought I was, she said, her voice growing quieter. But lately, especially since the engagement, I've been feeling like I'm following a script someone else wrote for me. Does that make sense? It made perfect sense. Amanda had excelled at meeting expectations, but in doing so, she'd never really explored what she wanted beyond those predetermined markers of success. Have you talked to David about this? About how you're feeling? Some, she said. He's actually more understanding than I expected. He keeps asking me what I want to do after the wedding, what kind of life I want to build, and I realize I don't have good answers. The vulnerability in her voice reminded me of conversations we'd had as children, before the family dynamics had positioned us as representatives of different approaches to life. Amanda, what made you call me this morning? Because I realized last night that I've been judging you for not following the path I chose, when maybe I should have been learning from your courage to choose your own path. The word courage surprised me. I'd never thought of my career choices in those terms, seeing them more as stubbornness or necessity than bravery. I have to go to a meeting, I said, glancing at the time, but I'd like to continue this conversation. Maybe we could have lunch this week? I'd really like that, Amanda said, sounding genuinely pleased. And, Jessica? Good luck with whatever decisions you're making about your career. I hope you choose what makes you happy, not what makes everyone else comfortable. After we hung up, I sat for a moment processing this unexpected conversation. Amanda's apology and self-reflection suggested that the previous evening's revelations had prompted more soul-searching in my family than I'd anticipated. Perhaps the shock of learning about my professional success had forced them to reconsider not just their assessment of me, but their assumptions about success and fulfillment more broadly. The cafe where I was meeting Eleanor Whitmore was a small, elegant establishment known for its excellent coffee and quiet atmosphere. I arrived a few minutes early and chose a table near the windows, ordering a cappuccino while I waited. Eleanor appeared precisely on time, a woman in her early 60s with silver hair, pulled back in a sophisticated chignon and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Miss Carter, she said, extending her hand with a firm grip. Thank you for meeting with me on such short notice. Please, call me Jessica, I replied. And thank you for reaching out. I have to admit, I'm curious about what you wanted to discuss. She ordered tea and settled into her chair with the composed manner of someone accustomed to conducting important business in casual settings. I've been following your work for several months. She began without preamble. The water contamination investigation caught my attention initially, but it was your approach to the story that impressed me most. My approach? You didn't just expose the violations, she explained. You connected them to broader patterns of environmental injustice, showed how these issues disproportionately affect low-income communities and communities of color. You understood that the story wasn't just about contaminated water, but about power structures that allow some people's health to be sacrificed for others' convenience. I felt a flush of pride at her assessment. That broader context had been important to me throughout the investigation, but not all editors had been interested in those connections. David Chen at the Tribune tells me you're considering some significant career opportunities, she continued, both in Chicago and in Washington. That's correct. Before you make your decision, I'd like you to consider a third option. Eleanor opened a leather portfolio and withdrew several documents, placing them on the table between us. My foundation is launching a new initiative called the Independent Journalism Project, she explained. We're creating a fellowship program that will fund investigative reporters to pursue long-term projects without the constraints of traditional newspaper deadlines or advertising concerns. I leaned forward, intrigued despite myself. The fellows would have complete editorial independence, substantial research budgets, and access to legal support when their investigations encounter resistance. The goal is to support the kind of in-depth reporting that creates real accountability and social change. That sounds incredible, I said honestly. What kind of projects are you looking to support? Exactly the kind of work you've been doing, she replied. Stories about government accountability, environmental justice, corporate corruption, systemic inequalities. We want to fund journalists who understand that their work is about more than just informing the public, it's about creating the conditions for positive social change. She slid one of the documents toward me. We'd like you to be our first fellow. I picked up the document, scanning the details with growing amazement. The fellowship provided a generous salary, benefits, and a research budget that exceeded what most newspapers allocated for entire investigative teams. The time commitment was for 2 years, with the possibility of renewal, and fellows would be based wherever they chose to work. This is incredibly generous, I said, looking up from the documents. But why me? There are investigative reporters with much more experience and established track records. Because experience without vision is just repetition, Eleanor replied. You've demonstrated not just technical skill as a reporter, but an understanding of how journalism can be a tool for justice. You see stories that others miss, and you tell them in ways that create empathy and action. What would be expected of the fellow? One major investigation per year, with complete freedom to choose the subject matter. Publication in whatever format best serves the story, whether that's traditional print, digital platforms, or multimedia presentations. And participation in our annual symposium on journalism and social justice. The opportunity was everything I'd dreamed of when I first entered journalism, the chance to pursue important stories without worrying about commercial viability or advertiser concerns. It would allow me to stay in Chicago while having the resources to investigate issues anywhere in the country. There's one more aspect of the fellowship I should mention, Eleanor said, her expression growing more serious. We provide comprehensive security support for fellows whose investigations might put them at risk. Legal protection, personal security if necessary, and relocation assistance if threats become serious. The mention of security reminded me that the kind of investigations she was describing often encountered serious resistance from powerful interests. My water contamination reporting had already generated some pushback from municipal officials and corporate representatives. Have other fellows needed that kind of protection? I asked. We're still selecting our first cohort, she admitted. But we've consulted with experienced investigative reporters about the realities of this work. When you're exposing corruption and holding powerful people accountable, there are sometimes consequences beyond professional ones. The sobering reality of what she was describing didn't deter me as much as it probably should have. If anything, it reinforced the importance of having institutional support for the kind of reporting that could create real change. I'd need time to consider this carefully, I said, and I'd want to understand more about the Foundation's oversight of fellows' work. Complete editorial independence, Eleanor assured me. The Foundation provides funding and support, but fellows choose their own stories and retain full control over their reporting. We believe that the best journalism happens when reporters follow their instincts and expertise without interference. We spent the next hour discussing the details of the fellowship, the Foundation's long-term vision for the program, and Eleanor's own background in supporting social justice initiatives. Her passion for the work was evident, but so was her understanding of the practical challenges facing independent journalism in the current media landscape. "Jessica," she said as our meeting began to wind down, "I want you to know that this offer isn't contingent on your decision about the other opportunities you're considering. Whether you take the Post position, the Tribune job, or something else entirely, we'd still want you to consider the fellowship for the future." "That's very generous of you." "It's practical," she corrected. "Good journalists are rare, and we want to support your career regardless of where it takes you initially." As I walked back to my apartment, my mind raced with the implications of Eleanor's offer. The fellowship represented a completely different model of journalism, one that prioritized impact over profit and gave reporters the resources to pursue stories that might take months or years to fully develop. My phone rang as I was climbing the stairs to my apartment. This time it was my mother, and I decided to answer despite my emotional exhaustion from family conversations. "Jessica, honey, I've been trying to reach you all morning," she said, her voice carrying a tone of urgent concern. "I've been busy, Mom. I had a meeting about work." "I wanted to talk about last night," she continued, "about what your father said, and about the wonderful news you shared with us." The shift in her tone from our typical conversations was noticeable. Instead of the slightly patronizing cheerfulness she usually employed when discussing my career, there was genuine respect and even a note of pride. "I'm listening," I said, settling into my reading chair. "I want you to know that I'm proud of you," she said, the words coming out in a rush as though she'd been practicing them. "I'm proud of the work you've done, of the recognition you've received, of the difference you're making in the world." The declaration surprised me with its directness. My mother rarely spoke so plainly about emotional matters, preferring to communicate through implication and suggestion. "Thank you, Mom. That means a lot to hear." "I also want to apologize," she continued, her voice growing more uncertain, "for not understanding what you were building, for not asking better questions about your work, for not supporting you the way I should have." "Mom, you don't need to apologize for not understanding journalism," I said gently. "But I do need to apologize for not trying to understand," she replied. "For deciding that your career wasn't worth learning about because it didn't fit what I thought success should look like." The distinction she was making was important, and I appreciated her recognition of it. "Your father is struggling with what happened last night," she admitted. "He's not good at admitting when he's wrong, especially about something this significant." "I know," I said. "But Mom, I need you to understand that I can't keep waiting for him to decide I'm worthy of basic respect and kindness." "I understand," she said quietly. "And I don't expect you to. I just hope that eventually we can find a way to rebuild our relationship on a better foundation." "I hope so too," I said, meaning it despite my wariness. After we hung up, I found myself thinking about the conversation I'd had with Michael the night before, Amanda's phone call that morning, and now my mother's apology. The revelation about my professional success had clearly prompted significant reflection among my family members, but I remained uncertain about whether these expressions of support represented genuine change or temporary guilt. My phone buzzed with a text from David Chen at the Tribune. "Hope your meeting with Eleanor went well. Still hoping to discuss our offer Monday morning. Whatever you decide, I want you to know how much I valued working with you." The kindness in his message reminded me why I'd enjoyed my relationship with the Tribune. David had been one of the first editors to take my work seriously, to see potential in my reporting before I'd established myself. Working for him on a permanent basis would mean continuing relationships that had already proven supportive and productive. But the fellowship Eleanor had described offered something no traditional newspaper position could provide: complete freedom to pursue the stories I felt were most important, with the resources to investigate them thoroughly and the time to develop them properly. The Washington Post offer remained attractive for different reasons: the prestige of working for one of the country's most respected newspapers, the opportunity to cover national stories, the chance to work alongside some of the most experienced investigative reporters in the field. As I sat in my apartment weighing these three remarkable opportunities, I realized that my decision process had fundamentally changed since the previous evening. Before my father's devastating words, I might have chosen based partly on what would most impress my family, what would finally prove my worth in their eyes. Now I was considering which opportunity would best serve my own goals and values, which would allow me to do the most meaningful work. The irony wasn't lost on me that my family's rejection had freed me to make decisions based purely on my own professional judgment. The pain of my father's words was still fresh, but they had also severed the invisible cord that had kept me seeking their approval, even as I consciously rejected their expectations. I pulled out my laptop and began drafting emails to each of the opportunities I was considering, not to accept or decline, but to ask the questions that would help me make the best decision. To the Washington Post, I wanted to understand more about their investigative team's current priorities and the resources they allocated to long-term projects. To the Tribune, I needed clarification about the scope of the investigative role they were offering and the kind of editorial support I could expect. To Eleanor's Foundation, I wanted details about the fellowship's relationship with traditional media outlets and how stories developed through the program would reach the public. As I worked on these emails, I found myself energized by the process of evaluation, rather than paralyzed by the need to make the right choice. For the first time in my career, I felt like I was choosing between genuinely good options, rather than trying to prove myself worthy of consideration. The afternoon sun was setting by the time I finished my correspondence, casting long shadows across my apartment. I had plans to meet my college roommate Sarah for dinner, something I'd arranged before the emotional upheaval of the past 24 hours. Part of me wanted to cancel, to spend the evening processing everything that had happened. But I also recognized that I needed the perspective of someone outside my family situation. Sarah had been my closest friend since our freshman year at Northwestern, and she'd watched my family dynamics with the clear-eyed assessment of an outsider. She'd never understood why I sought approval from people who seemed determined not to give it, and she'd been encouraging me for years to stop measuring my success by their standards. As I prepared to leave for dinner, I reflected on how dramatically my circumstances had changed in just 24 hours. Yesterday morning, I'd been an overlooked family member preparing to share good news at a holiday dinner. Now I was a journalist with multiple prestigious career opportunities, finally free from the emotional constraints that had limited my decision-making for years. The transformation felt both liberating and slightly terrifying. Freedom to choose purely based on my own values and goals was something I'd claimed to want for years, but actually having it felt like stepping into uncharted territory. The family approval I'd sought had been a burden, but it had also been a familiar compass. Making decisions without reference to their expectations required trusting my own judgment in ways I'd never been forced to do before. My phone rang one final time as I gathered my coat and purse. The caller ID showed my father's name, and I stared at it for several rings before deciding to answer. "Dad," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "Jessica," he replied, and I could hear the strain in his voice. "I was hoping we could talk." "What about?" "About last night. About the things I said and the things you told us afterward." The conversation I'd been dreading since leaving my parents' house was finally happening, but I felt surprisingly calm as I prepared to engage with it. "I'm listening," I said, settling back into my chair and canceling my dinner plans with a quick text to Sarah. "I was wrong," he said simply, the words carrying a weight I'd never heard from him before. "About your career, about your choices, about the value of what you've been building." The admission was significant, but I found myself waiting to hear what came next before responding. "I spent the night reading your articles," he continued. "All of them. The water contamination series, the school board investigation, the pieces about healthcare access in rural communities. Jessica, your work is extraordinary." "Thank you," I said carefully. "But more than that, I realize that I've been measuring your success by standards that have nothing to do with the actual impact of your work. I've been so focused on traditional markers of achievement that I completely miss the fact that you're already achieving something much more important." The conversation felt surreal after years of criticism and dismissal. Part of me had longed to hear exactly these words from him, but now that they were coming, I felt surprisingly detached from them. "Dad, I appreciate you saying that," I said, "but I need you to understand that the damage from last night, from years of feeling like I had to justify my existence to this family, isn't something that can be fixed with one conversation. I know, he said quietly. And I'm not asking you to forgive me or pretend that things can go back to the way they were. I'm just asking for the chance to try to build something better going forward. The humility in his voice was unprecedented, and I found myself considering whether the man who had raised me was capable of the kind of fundamental change that would be necessary for us to have a healthy relationship. What would that look like? I asked. I don't know yet, he admitted. But I'd like to find out, if you're willing to give me the chance. As I hung up the phone after promising to consider his request, I realized that my family's sudden recognition of my worth presented its own kind of challenge. It would be easy to let their newfound respect influence my career decisions, to choose the path that would most impress them now that they were finally paying attention. But the freedom I'd gained from their rejection was too valuable to surrender, even in exchange for their approval. Whatever choice I made about my career would be mine alone, based on my own assessment of where I could do the most meaningful work and build the most fulfilling life. The evening ahead promised more conversations, more reflections, and perhaps the beginning of new relationships with family members who were finally ready to see me as I actually was. But first, I had decisions to make about my own future, choices that would shape not just my career, but the kind of person I wanted to become. The weekend that followed passed in a blur of phone calls, emails, and deep introspection. I'd rescheduled my dinner with Sarah for Sunday evening, giving myself time to process the cascade of opportunities and family revelations that had emerged from Thursday's disaster. By Monday morning, I had responses from all three organizations I was considering, each one more compelling than I'd anticipated. The Washington Post had invited me to visit their newsroom for a full day of meetings with the investigative team, editors, and senior management. They wanted me to see firsthand how their operation worked and meet the colleagues I'd potentially be joining. The Tribune had scheduled a formal presentation for their board of directors, where I would outline my vision for their expanded investigative unit. Eleanor Whitmore's foundation had sent additional materials about their fellowship program, including profiles of the advisory board members who would provide guidance and support. I sat at my kitchen table Monday morning, reviewing all the materials while drinking coffee that had grown cold hours earlier. Each opportunity represented a different version of my professional future, and I found myself sketching out what my life might look like under each scenario. Working for the Post would mean relocating to Washington, immersing myself in the epicenter of American political journalism, and joining a team with resources and influence I'd never experienced. The stories I could pursue there would have national scope and significance. The prestige and platform would elevate my career in ways that could open doors for decades to come. The Tribune position would allow me to stay in Chicago, the city that had become my real home, while building something new from the ground up. I'd have the satisfaction of creating an investigative program shaped by my own vision and values. The local focus would mean developing deeper expertise in the communities and issues I'd already been covering. The fellowship represented the most radical departure from traditional journalism career paths. Complete independence, substantial resources, and the freedom to pursue whatever stories I felt were most important. It was risky in its unconventionality, but it also offered the potential for maximum impact. My phone rang, interrupting my analysis. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, I heard a voice that made my stomach drop. Ms. Carter, this is Robert Hayes from Hayes & Associates. The name meant nothing to me, but his tone was formal and vaguely threatening. I'm calling regarding your recent reporting on municipal water systems. What about it? I asked, immediately alert. My clients have some concerns about inaccuracies in your articles and the damage they've caused to their reputations. We'd like to arrange a meeting to discuss these matters. Your clients. Several of the municipal officials mentioned in your series. They feel they've been unfairly characterized and are considering their legal options. The call was clearly intended to intimidate me, a common tactic used by powerful interests when investigative reporting threatened their positions. I'd heard about such calls from other journalists, but this was my first direct experience with this kind of pressure. Mr. Hayes, I said, keeping my voice steady, everything in my reporting was thoroughly fact-checked and documented. If your clients have specific concerns about accuracy, they can contact my editors through proper channels. "This is a courtesy call, Ms. Carter. My clients would prefer to resolve this matter quietly, but they're prepared to take more formal action if necessary." After I hung up, I sat staring at my phone, processing what had just happened. The timing of the intimidation attempt was suspicious, coming just as I was considering career moves that would give me more resources and institutional support for exactly this kind of reporting. I immediately called David Chen at the Tribune to report the conversation. His response was swift and supportive. "This confirms what we suspected," he said. "Your water contamination investigation has rattled some powerful people. That's exactly why we want you on our team permanently, with full legal backing and institutional support. Have you dealt with this kind of pressure before?" "Regularly," he assured me. "It's the cost of doing meaningful investigative work. But Jessica, you can't let intimidation tactics influence your reporting or your career decisions. That's exactly what they're designed to do." His words reminded me of Eleanor Whitmore's mention of security support for fellowship recipients. The realities of investigative journalism were becoming more concrete as I faced them directly. An hour later, I received another call, this one from the editor-in-chief of the Washington Post. "Jessica, I hope you don't mind me calling directly," she said. "I wanted to discuss the timeline for your decision and address any concerns you might have about joining our team." "I appreciate the personal attention," I replied. "I'm still evaluating all my options carefully. I understand you've received other offers, which speaks to the quality of your work. But I want to make sure you understand what the Post can provide that other organizations might not." She went on to describe their legal department's experience defending investigative reporters, their security protocols for journalists working on sensitive stories, and their commitment to supporting staff through the challenges that came with high-impact reporting. "We've been following the response to your water contamination series," she continued. "We know you're likely facing some pushback from the officials you exposed. That's exactly the kind of reporting we want to support and protect." The conversation reinforced my growing understanding that the choice I was making involved more than just career advancement. I was selecting the institutional framework that would support and protect my ability to do challenging investigative work. That afternoon, I met with Eleanor Whitmore again, this time at her foundation's offices in a renovated warehouse in the West Loop. The space was impressive in its understated way, combining modern technology with historic architectural details. Eleanor introduced me to several staff members, including the legal counsel who would support fellowship recipients, and the security consultant who assessed potential risks. "I wanted you to meet the full team," Eleanor explained as we settled in her office overlooking the Chicago River. "The fellowship isn't just funding for your work. It's membership in a community committed to supporting fearless journalism." "Speaking of fearless," I said, "I received an intimidation call this morning from lawyers representing some of the officials I exposed in the water contamination series." Eleanor's expression sharpened with interest rather than concern. "Tell me about it." I described the conversation with Robert Hayes, and Eleanor took notes while I spoke. "This is exactly why we built comprehensive support systems into the fellowship program," she said when I finished. "Our legal team has extensive experience with these kinds of pressure tactics. More importantly, we have the resources to fight back aggressively when necessary." "Fight back how?" "Sometimes the best defense is a strong offense," she explained. "When powerful interests try to intimidate investigative reporters, we've found that shining additional light on their behavior often makes them retreat quickly." She pulled out a folder and showed me examples of how the foundation had supported other journalists facing similar pressure. In one case, they'd funded a follow-up investigation that exposed the very law firm attempting to silence the original reporting. In another, they'd organized a coalition of journalism organizations to publicly condemn intimidation tactics. "The fellowship provides more than just individual support," Eleanor continued. "It connects you to a network of journalists, lawyers, and advocates who understand that protecting press freedom requires active defense, not just passive resistance." The institutional support she was describing was compelling, but it also underscored the serious nature of the work I'd be undertaking. This wasn't just about career advancement anymore. It was about choosing the framework that would best support my ability to hold powerful interests accountable. That evening, I had dinner with Sarah at our favorite restaurant in Wicker Park. She'd been my closest friend through all the ups and downs of building my journalism career, and I trusted her perspective more than almost anyone's. "So let me get this straight," she said after I'd filled her in on the weekend's developments. "You have 3 amazing job offers, Your family is finally recognizing your worth, and you're getting intimidation calls from lawyers. That's quite a week. That's one way to put it, I replied, grateful for her ability to find humor in even complex situations. How are you feeling about the family stuff? I considered the question carefully. Confused, honestly. Part of me feels vindicated that they're finally acknowledging my work, but another part of me is angry that it took external validation for them to see what was always there. And how much is their newfound respect influencing your career decision? I'm trying not to let it, I said, but it's hard to completely separate those factors. The Tribune job would keep me close to family as we try to rebuild our relationships. The fellowship would give me the flexibility to maintain those connections while doing independent work. The Post job would give me physical distance that might be healthy. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. You know what strikes me about this whole situation? What? For years you've been trying to prove yourself worthy of their approval. Now you finally have it, but you've also discovered you don't need it anymore. Her observation cut to the heart of my internal conflict. The family acceptance I'd craved for years was finally being offered, but my father's devastating words on Thanksgiving had freed me from needing their validation to feel confident in my choices. Maybe the real question, Sarah continued, isn't which job will most impress your family, but which one will most challenge and fulfill you personally. I think I know the answer to that, I admitted, but it's also the riskiest choice. The fellowship? I nodded. It's completely unconventional, there's no traditional career path beyond it, and I'd be giving up the security of established institutions. But it would give me complete freedom to pursue the stories I think are most important, with resources I could never access otherwise. That sounds like it aligns perfectly with why you became a journalist in the first place. She was right, and her clarity helped me see through the complexity that had been clouding my judgment. I'd entered journalism because I believed it could be a force for positive change, because I wanted to hold power accountable and give voice to people who were often ignored. The fellowship offered the purest opportunity to pursue that mission. Tuesday morning brought another surprise. I received a call from a producer at 60 Minutes who had seen my water contamination investigation and wanted to discuss adapting it for television. The conversation was flattering and exciting, but it also made me realize how the scope of opportunities was expanding beyond what I'd ever imagined possible. Your reporting methodology is exactly what we look for, the producer explained. You've built relationships with sources, documented everything meticulously, and told the story in a way that creates both understanding and emotional connection. I appreciate the interest, I said, but I should mention that I'm currently considering several career opportunities that might affect my availability for collaborations. What kind of opportunities? When I described the 3 positions I was weighing, her response surprised me. Have you considered that those choices aren't mutually exclusive? She asked. The fellowship especially sounds like it could complement television collaborations beautifully. You'd have the independence to pursue investigations that could work across multiple platforms. The conversation planted an idea I hadn't previously considered. Maybe my decision didn't have to be about choosing a single path, but about selecting the foundation that would support the most diverse and impactful work. That afternoon, I met with Michael for coffee. He'd asked to see me again, saying he had something important to discuss. We met at a cafe near his office in the Loop, and I was struck by how different our interaction felt compared to our conversation the previous Thursday evening. I wanted to update you on some conversations I've been having with Mom and Dad, he said after we'd ordered our drinks. About what? About the changes we need to make as a family if we want to repair our relationships with you. The fact that they were having these conversations without me felt both encouraging and concerning. I appreciated their recognition that change was necessary, but I was wary of having decisions made about my life without my input. What kinds of changes? Dad's been researching your articles and the awards you've received. He spent Sunday afternoon reading about investigative journalism, trying to understand what you actually do and why it's important. That's a start, I said carefully. Mom wants to subscribe to all the publications you write for, and she's asked Amanda and me to explain any technical aspects she doesn't understand. The image of my mother trying to educate herself about my profession was both touching and slightly absurd. She'd spent years dismissing work she'd never bothered to understand. Michael, I appreciate that they're making an effort, I said. But I need you to understand that rebuilding trust takes more than reading articles and showing interest. It requires acknowledging the harm that was done and demonstrating consistent change over time. I know, he said seriously, and I think they're beginning to understand that too. Dad especially is struggling with how to acknowledge the damage his words and attitudes have caused. What about you? I asked. How are you processing all of this? Honestly, I'm realizing how much I've missed by not taking your work seriously. Reading your investigations made me understand that you're not just a good writer, you're an important journalist doing work that matters. Thank you, I said, feeling a warmth toward my brother that had been absent for years. I also wanted to tell you that whatever career decision you make, you have my full support, whether you stay in Chicago or move to Washington, whether you take a traditional job or try something completely different. The unconditional support he was offering felt genuine and valuable, especially coming after years of subtle pressure to choose a more conventional path. Wednesday brought a development I hadn't anticipated. I received a call from the mayor's office requesting a meeting about my water contamination reporting. The invitation was framed as an opportunity to discuss potential policy changes based on my findings, but I was suspicious of the timing. I agreed to the meeting but insisted it be on the record, and that I be allowed to bring a colleague for support. David Chen from the Tribune agreed to accompany me, and we met with the mayor and several department heads at City Hall. Ms. Carter, the mayor began, your reporting has raised important questions about oversight of our water systems. We'd like to work with you on developing solutions. I appreciate your interest in addressing these issues, I replied. What specific changes are you considering? What followed was a lengthy discussion about improved testing protocols, enhanced transparency measures, and stronger enforcement mechanisms. It was exactly the kind of policy response that good investigative journalism was supposed to generate. We'd like to announce these reforms in conjunction with a follow-up article from you, the mayor's press secretary suggested. Something that shows how your reporting has led to positive changes. I'd be interested in covering the reforms, I said, but as an independent journalist, not as part of a coordinated announcement. The distinction was important. My role was to monitor and evaluate their response to my reporting, not to become part of their public relations strategy. After the meeting, David and I debriefed over coffee. That was fascinating, he said. They're clearly feeling pressure from your series and want to control the narrative around their response. Do you think the reforms they're proposing are genuine? Some of them, probably. But they're also trying to neutralize the impact of your reporting by making you part of their solution. His analysis reinforced my understanding of the complex relationship between journalism and the institutions it covers. The most effective reporting maintained independence even when it achieved positive outcomes. Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after the Thanksgiving dinner that had changed everything, I made my decision. I called Eleanor Whitmore first. I'd like to accept the fellowship, I told her, with one condition. What's that? I want to maintain relationships with traditional publications for stories that would benefit from their platforms. The Tribune especially has been supportive of my work, and I'd like to continue collaborating with them. That's perfectly acceptable, Eleanor assured me. The fellowship is designed to support your work, not constrain it. If collaborating with established publications serves your journalistic goals, we encourage it. Next, I called David Chen at the Tribune. I've decided to accept the fellowship with Whitmore's Foundation, I told him. But I'd like to discuss an ongoing relationship with the Tribune for stories that fit your mission. I'm disappointed we won't have you on staff, he said, but I'm excited about the possibility of collaborating on investigations. The fellowship will give you resources we could never provide. Finally, I called the Washington Post to decline their offer. We're sorry to lose you, the editor-in-chief said, but we respect your decision. If you're ever interested in traditional newspaper work in the future, we'd love to continue the conversation. The graciousness of all three organizations reinforced my belief that I was making the right choice. I wasn't burning bridges or closing doors. I was selecting the path that would give me the most freedom and resources to do the work I felt called to do. That evening, I called my parents to share my decision. My father answered the phone, and for the first time in our adult relationship, he sounded genuinely interested in hearing about my professional choices. Dad, I wanted to let you know about my career decision, I said. I'm listening, he replied, and I could hear the attention in his voice. I explained the fellowship, its unconventional nature, and the opportunities it would provide for independent investigative work. That sounds like exactly the right choice for you, he said when I finished. It matches your values and gives you the independence you've always sought. You're not concerned about the lack of traditional security? Jessica, I'm beginning to understand that you've never been interested in traditional security. You've built something much more valuable: expertise, reputation, and the ability to do work that makes a difference. The conversation was brief but marked a fundamental shift in how my father related to my professional life. Instead of trying to direct my choices toward conventional markers of success, he was recognizing and supporting the path I'd chosen for myself. As I hung up the phone, I felt a sense of completion that had been missing throughout the week of decision-making. I'd chosen the opportunity that best aligned with my values and goals, maintained important professional relationships, and begun rebuilding family connections on healthier foundations. The fellowship would officially begin in January, giving me time to complete current freelance commitments and prepare for this new phase of my career. I spent the weekend planning investigations I wanted to pursue, researching issues that had been on my back burner for lack of resources, and imagining the kind of impact I could achieve with the Foundation's support. My phone buzzed with congratulations from colleagues who had heard about my fellowship. The journalism community in Chicago was tight-knit, and news of my decision had spread quickly. The responses were uniformly positive, with several veteran reporters noting that the Foundation's support model represented an important innovation in how investigative journalism could be funded and sustained. That Sunday evening, I sat in my apartment reviewing the events of the past week. 7 days earlier, I'd been preparing for a family dinner that I expected to be awkward but manageable. Instead, I'd experienced the most devastating family confrontation of my adult life, received multiple prestigious job offers, faced my first serious intimidation attempt, and ultimately chosen a career path that was both risky and full of potential. The transformation felt profound but also natural, as though the events had revealed possibilities that had always been there, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. My father's cruel words had been intended to diminish me, but they'd actually freed me from constraints I hadn't fully recognized I was carrying. The family relationships that we're now rebuilding felt different, based on mutual respect rather than conditional acceptance. The career path I'd chosen reflected my authentic values rather than external expectations. The work I'd be doing would have the resources and support to achieve maximum impact. As I prepared for bed, I found myself looking forward to the future with an excitement I hadn't felt since my early days as a journalist. The fellowship represented not just a job opportunity but the chance to pursue the kind of journalism I'd always dreamed of doing, with the freedom and resources to do it well. My phone buzzed one final time with a text from Amanda. "Proud of you for choosing your own path. Can't wait to see what you accomplish next." The message encapsulated something important about the week's events. For the first time in my adult life, my family was proud of me for being exactly who I'd chosen to become, rather than disappointed that I wasn't someone else. That shift, combined with the professional opportunities now ahead of me, felt like the beginning of a fundamentally different chapter in my life. 6 months later, I stood in the federal courthouse in Detroit, watching as the third municipal official from my water contamination investigation was led away in handcuffs. The courtroom was packed with families who had been affected by the cover-up, many of whom I'd interviewed during my original reporting. Their presence felt like validation of everything I'd worked toward as a journalist. The fellowship had exceeded even my highest expectations. With the Foundation's resources behind me, I'd been able to expand the water contamination investigation into a comprehensive examination of environmental justice issues across the Midwest. The legal support Eleanor had promised proved invaluable when my reporting triggered multiple lawsuits and intimidation attempts. Each time powerful interests tried to silence my work, the Foundation's legal team responded with swift and decisive action. My phone buzzed with a text from my editor at 60 Minutes. The television adaptation of my investigation would air the following week, bringing national attention to issues that had been hidden in small communities for decades. The multimedia approach had amplified the impact of my reporting in ways I'd never imagined possible. Outside the courthouse, I was approached by Maria Santos, one of the mothers whose child had developed health problems from contaminated water. She'd been one of my earliest sources, trusting me with her family's story when no one else would listen. "Thank you," she said simply, tears in her eyes. "You kept your promise. You made sure people couldn't ignore what happened to our children." Her words reminded me why I'd chosen journalism in the first place. The fellowship had given me the freedom to pursue stories like Maria's without worrying about commercial viability or editorial constraints. I'd been able to spend months building trust with sources, documenting evidence, and crafting narratives that created both understanding and action. The drive back to Chicago gave me time to reflect on how dramatically my life had changed since that devastating Thanksgiving dinner. The fellowship had transformed not just my career but my understanding of what was possible when journalistic integrity met adequate resources and institutional support. My family relationships had evolved as well, though more gradually than my professional circumstances. My father and I now had regular conversations about my work, and his questions demonstrated genuine interest rather than skeptical tolerance. He'd even attended one of my speaking engagements, introducing himself to other attendees as Jessica's proud father. My mother had become an unlikely advocate for investigative journalism, sharing my articles on social media and explaining their significance to her friends. Amanda had found her own path toward meaningful work, using her engagement as an opportunity to explore social causes she'd previously ignored. Michael and I had developed the kind of adult-sibling relationship I'd never thought possible, built on mutual respect and genuine interest in each other's lives. His financial expertise had even proved useful when I needed to understand complex corporate structures in my investigations. The Foundation's offices had become my second home, filled with colleagues who shared my commitment to journalism as a tool for social change. Eleanor Whitmore had become both a mentor and a friend, helping me navigate the challenges of independent reporting while protecting my editorial independence. My apartment remained my sanctuary, but it now featured a wall of recognition that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. The Pulitzer Prize notification had arrived in March, making me one of the youngest recipients in the award's history. The recognition had opened doors I'd never expected, but more importantly, it had validated the path I'd chosen despite years of family doubt. The intimidation tactics that had initially worried me had largely ceased after the Foundation's aggressive response sent a clear message that my reporting was fully protected. The legal victories we'd achieved had established precedents that would benefit other investigative journalists facing similar pressure. As I pulled into my parking spot that evening, I received a call from my father. These conversations had become routine, but they still felt remarkable given our history. "Jessica, I saw the news coverage of today's sentencing," he said. "I wanted to tell you how proud I am of what you've accomplished." "Thank you, Dad. It feels good to see justice finally served for these families." "I've been thinking about that night last November," he continued, his voice growing more serious. "About the terrible things I said to you. Dad, we've moved past that. No, I need to say this. I told you that we'd all be happier if you left forever. But the truth is, we're all better people because you stayed and fought for what you believed in. Your courage to pursue difficult stories, to stand up to powerful interests, to choose integrity over approval, has taught this entire family something important about what really matters." His words carried a weight that formal apologies couldn't match. He was acknowledging not just that he'd been wrong about my career, but that my choices had been right in ways he was only beginning to understand. "Your mother and I have been talking about hosting Thanksgiving this year," he added. "A real celebration of what you've built, what you've achieved, and who you've become." The invitation represented a complete reversal from the holiday that had changed everything. Instead of dreading family judgment, I was being asked to help them celebrate my authentic self. "I'd like that," I said, meaning it completely. That weekend, I received a letter from Eleanor, announcing the Foundation's expansion of the fellowship program. My success had demonstrated the model's potential, and they were funding 5 additional journalists to pursue independent investigations. I'd been asked to help mentor the new fellows, sharing what I'd learned about navigating the challenges and opportunities of unconventional journalism. The work ahead remained challenging and important. My current investigation into pharmaceutical companies' influence on rural healthcare access was already generating the kind of resistance that indicated I was asking the right questions. But I now approached such challenges with confidence born of experience and the knowledge that I had institutional support for my mission. Standing in my apartment that Sunday evening, looking out at the Chicago skyline that had become the backdrop for my transformed life, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with ending and everything to do with becoming. The young woman who had fled this city years earlier, seeking distance from family judgment, had returned as someone who no longer needed external validation to know her worth. The fellowship had given me more than career advancement. It had provided the framework to pursue journalism as a calling rather than just a profession. The family relationships that had once been sources of pain had evolved into foundations of support and understanding. The intimidation that had initially frightened me had been met with institutional protection that allowed me to continue my work without compromise. My phone buzzed with a message from a source in my current investigation, providing a document that would likely break the story wide open. As I prepared to dive into another evening of research and analysis, I felt the familiar excitement of pursuing truth through journalism, supported by resources that matched the importance of the work. The path from that devastating Thanksgiving dinner to this moment of professional and personal fulfillment hadn't been linear or easy. But every challenge had taught me something valuable about resilience, authenticity, and the power of choosing courage over comfort. The family that had once told me I'd be better off gone now celebrated my presence and achievements. The career that had been dismissed as impractical had evolved into a platform for meaningful change. As I settled into my workspace for another night of investigation, I reflected on how completely my circumstances had transformed. The woman who had driven away from her childhood home, feeling rejected and worthless, had become someone whose work protected vulnerable communities and held powerful interests accountable. The fellowship had provided the foundation, but the transformation had come from finally choosing to believe in my own worth regardless of others' opinions. The stories ahead promised to be as challenging and important as any I'd pursued, but I now approached them with the confidence of someone who had found her true calling and the institutional support to pursue it without compromise. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.